Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Laura Roberts, and I'm the Ava Marketing Manager at PDS Group. For those of you who may not be familiar with PDS Ava, we build cloud-hosted software which addresses key limitations in existing reservoir modeling workflows. Today's session is presented by Matthew Meyer, a geologist in PDS Ava's team, and currently supporting the development of Ava Saturation. Geoscientists don't often have the luxury of calculating multiple saturation height functions, but doing so can have important implications for the investigation of volumetric uncertainty. Over the next half hour or so, using data from the Browse Basin in Northwest Australia, Matt will demonstrate how Ava Saturation offers a quick, intuitive, and auditable way of calculating multiple height functions which can be directly mapped into reservoir modeling platforms. We'll kick today's session off with a little housekeeping and then jump straight into Matthew's presentation. So before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Matthew is happy to answer them throughout the session. There will also be time at the end of the webinar for questions and discussion, and we'll be joined by Matt Boyer, Ava Saturation Product Manager. If you wish to ask questions then, you can type them in the question box, or alternatively, if your question requires a little more explanation, use the raise your hand function, and I'll turn your microphone on so you can ask it verbally instead. We're also keen to hear your thoughts on saturation height function workflows, so we'll run a couple of polls throughout the session to gather your views and kickstart a discussion. Matthew joined PDS Group in 2016 after completing a PhD in paleomagnetism and structural geology at the University of Plymouth. Since joining PDS Group, Matthew has been involved in the development of the Ava product line and more recently has focused on bringing Ava Saturation to the market. Without any further ado, I'll turn the time over to Matthew.
Hi there everyone, thanks for joining and thank you for the introduction, Laura. It's great to be speaking to you all today and I hope you take a lot from the webinar. Just a quick run through of the agenda first before we get started. I'll start from the beginning and first introduce what saturation height functions are and why they are so important. I will then briefly explain how saturation height functions are constructed at present, with a focus on how geologists build saturation height functions. And finally, I will introduce and demonstrate PDS's latest Ava technology, Ava Saturation. Log-based water saturation equations, such as those of Archie, calculate water saturation at particular depths and for a particular formation downhole. However, it is the saturation height function that allows us to calculate fluid saturations at any given point in a reservoir. Over the years, many different methods for calculating a saturation height function have been developed, and these broadly fall into three categories. You have log-based methods, such as the Cuddy-Foyle function, capillary pressure-based methods, such as the Leverett J function, and combined log and capillary pressure-based methods, such as Skelt-Harrison function. So on the right-hand side, we have a sort of a diagram of a saturation height function. And a saturation height function is a way of visualizing and predicting the distribution of fluids through a reservoir relative to water saturation. So hopefully you can see my pointer. So at the base of the graph, you've got the free water level. Here, capillary pressure equals 0. Here, the rock will be 100% saturated with formation water. At some vertical distance above the free water level, the PD is reached, so the displacement pressure is reached, defining the oil-water contact. Above the oil-water contact, both oil and water are mobile, while below the oil-water contact, only water is present. At increasing distance from the free water level, water saturation will decrease from 100 to irreducible levels. The area between the oil-water contact and the irreducible intersect is the transition zone, where both oil and water are producible. At irreducible water, water is no longer mobile and will therefore not flow, resulting in water-free hydrocarbon production. So why are saturation height functions so important? Water saturation is fundamental to modeling the volume of hydrocarbons in a reservoir. Water saturation particularly is an important parameter in the STOIP or GIP equation, as shown below. Incorrect saturation height functions can lead to misleading or potentially wrong volume calculations, inconsistencies between static and dynamic models, and inaccurate representations of fluids within a reservoir. So who builds the saturation height function? Preferably, the construction of the saturation height function would fall to an experienced petrophysicist. However, typically this part of the workflow will fall on the desk of a petroleum geologist, who must, as shown, make several important decisions that can greatly affect the hydrocarbon volume calculation of a reservoir. At present, methods used by geologists involve using spreadsheet software, such as Excel, or unauditable workflow steps in common reservoir modeling platforms, such as Petrel. TechLog Wellbore software platform is one of several industry standard packages used by petrophysicists for calculating saturation height functions. However, significant training and expenses are required to become fully proficient with this software. So this is the reason why geologists tend to use Excel and then move on to Petrel as well as alternatives. So after that brief introduction to saturation height functions and why they're important and how today's people are modeling them, I will briefly hand over to Laura to conduct our first webinar poll to find out how you build your saturation height functions.
So you can now take part in the first of our webinar polls by simply clicking on your screen and voting for the option that fits best how you construct your saturation height function. I'll give you a few minutes to vote, and then I'll share the results with everyone in the webinar. So we have a 50-50 split now that everyone has voted. 50% of you use Microsoft Excel, and the rest of you use petrophysical software such as TechLog platforms.
Thank you very much, Laura. So it would seem that we have a split in the room. We clearly have a couple of petrophysicists or some very well-educated geologists in there who can know how to use TechLog. But we clearly also have some geologists, I assume, who generally use Excel, and then they'll take their Excel function into Petrel. So the typical workflow used by a geologist, so as a geologist, this is the workflow that I would use in Excel, starts with exporting and importing large amounts of data, which is both time-consuming and potentially error-prone. Once a saturation height function has been built, long calculator if statements are needed to use the function in Petrel, again leading to possible errors and typos. Lots of different formula are also needed if you're using the Excel workflow, because you also need to calculate your Archie SW, your porosity, and also your BVW. So hopefully I'm building up a picture here that there's spaces within this workflow that lead to errors creeping into the calculations. It's also difficult to preserve the audit trail and the reasoning behind geological choices in Excel, while it's also difficult to test water saturation uncertainty. Another fundamental problem with using Excel and then going into Petrel is that Petrel and Excel also have different syntaxes. So they use different commands and different code to actually build the function. So again, an error could creep in here. Or the Excel workflow is also very time consuming. So my example here, my little screen grab from Excel, it's only one well, it's also one function, but it can still take time. It takes time to export and import data. It takes time to make sure the calculations are correct. And as I mentioned, this is just one method. What about testing other methods? Because as I introduced earlier, there's more than one method for calculating a saturation height function. Here in this example, I've used the Cuddy-Foyle function, but there's also multiple other methods out there that are standard in the industry. And as I've said, this last point is important, as different methods do in fact give you a different picture of the fluid distribution in a reservoir. To show this more visually, I constructed 3 different saturation height functions from the same dataset, from the Crux 1 well in the Crux field, Browse Basin, Northwest Australia. As you can see, hopefully you can see my pointer. There are 2 sandstone units, the Noma B and the Noma A, separated by a mudstone facies. The 3 methods, the Cuddy-Foyle method, the Scout-Harrison method, and the Leverett-J method were used, and as you can see, produce 3 visually different functions and different representations of water saturation within this segment of the model. This is again highlighted when plotting the function on a water saturation versus height above free water level plot, where our blue line is our Cuddy function, our green line is our Scout-Harrison function, and our orange line is the Leverett-J function. The difference in the function is also shown in the volume estimates. So as you can see, where our 3 functions are similar, we have fairly similar volume estimates for the Noma A sandstone at the top of this section. Whereas as we move down section, we can see there's a divergence between our 3 functions. The Cuddy-Foyle function appears to be a bit more pessimistic, whereas the Scout-Harrison function and the leverage J function appears to be a bit more optimistic in terms of the level of water versus oil within these facies. So in this study, only one well with excellent data for saturation modeling was used. In practice, when working multiple wells with a time constraint and a budget, the time to indulge in constructing endless saturation models is just not available. That being said, this study has shown that with time and budget considered, it is valuable to explore a variety of approaches to modeling water saturation. Imagine, armed with the leverage J function, you may have decided to perforate Crux 1 straight down to the free water level, confident that your water cut would be minimal. On the other hand, with the Cuddy 4 function on the table, you may decide to be a little bit more pessimistic and perforate your well only down to the top of the Noma B sandstone to save yourself from possibly a significant water cut and the problems and costs this can bring. Accurately determining the distribution of fluids within hydrocarbon-producing reservoirs is of fundamental importance. Without it, correctly calculating the hydrocarbon volume of a fault block or an entire field is impossible. So is there a better way? We think so. So introducing Ava Saturation. So Ava Saturation is software to optimize the saturation modeling workflow. We've built it to support geologists to rapidly build and implement saturation height functions into their reservoir models. At the heart of Ava Saturation is the saturation concept. This is an auditable document that preserves calculations and guides the user through the workflow with data interrogation and plotting functionality. Ava Saturation is also data aware, so the saturation concept seamlessly updates, giving you more time for e.g. multiple well analysis and exploring the impact of using alternative models. Before we jump into Ava Saturation, I'll briefly describe the Crux 1 dataset in more detail. So the Crux 1 well was the first well drilled into the Crux field. As I said, it was located in northwest Australia, and Crux 1 encountered gas within the Noma A and the Noma B sandstone. And RFT pressure data indicate that the two sands are in pressure equilibrium, despite the presence of the Noma B mudstone between them. So this implies that these two sandstones are in communication. So we can build one saturation height function for both these zones together. Okay, so I'll just jump into Petrel. Excellent. Okay, so Ava Saturation is a web-based application embedded within Petrel EMP software platform as a plugin. To open the plugin, you can select the Ava Saturation window in the window drop-down menu located on the Home toolbar ribbon. Alternatively, Ava Saturation can be opened from the specific Ava ribbon. So I'll just close this to give a bit more room. The home page of Ava Saturation acts as an entry point where users can see a wealth of information and resources related to Ava Saturation and the Ava Saturation workflow. Helpful resources focused on saturation modeling in general are also stored here for reference. The Ava Saturation library page stores previously created saturation concepts for future use. Information such as the title and date and time of creation of the saturation concept are given, along with an abridged version of the saturation concept description. So in true Blue Peter style, I shall open up a saturation concept that I started working on earlier today. And once it loads, so at the heart of the Ava Saturation is, as I explained, the saturation concept. Here the user is guided through the saturation modeling workflow step by step, from data interrogation to the creation of a saturation height function, which can then be directly mapped to a Petrel reservoir model. In the concept details section, you can title your saturation concept and capture additional information related to the project or asset you are working on. As you will see, Ava Saturation references your logs and grid properties to construct saturation height functions. However, no confidential data is stored within the saturation concept. Only the pathways are stored, so Ava Saturation can find the appropriate data at a subsequent time. In the data interrogation section, the user can create a number of configurable charts and apply a series of filters to further explore their data to really see what their data is showing them and to identify any trends that may be present. This is a key step in Ava Saturation workflow as it enables the user to assign their data into appropriate groups relative to the contacts, zones, or segments that have been built into their reservoir model. So as here, the base, I've got a porosity versus water saturation plot. I've added just for the Crux 1 well data. So without further ado, I shall get on to the sort of the crux of the matter, the saturation height function. So to construct a saturation height function, we must first select the 3D grid and the context set you wish to map your saturation height function to. So here, Ava Saturation has referenced the 4 grids that are within my model. So we can select the grid that we wish to use. So I'll select this one. And then Ava Saturation has then looked at that grid and found that there are 3 usable contact sets within that grid. So again, we can select that grid. So when I introduced the data, the data suggested that the gas was encountered within the Noma A and Noma B sandstone, and both these sandstones were in communication. So what we could do is we could build individual saturation height functions for both these zones, or what we can do with Ava Saturation is we can actually group the 2 zones together and create one saturation height function that uses the data from both these zones at the same time. We can then rename this group accordingly. If, for example, we had 2 segments that were in communication as well within our model, we can group those segments together. But as we saw, Crux 1 only is drilled into segment 3, so we only need to worry about 1 segment in this particular saturation height function. The data also show us that there is gas present within this channel sand facies and also the silty sand facies. So again, we can use our grouping tool and group these 2 facies together and rename them accordingly as our net facies. You also have the option of selecting, if you have multiple facies models within your grid, you have the opportunity to select the model that you wish to use. So we've now subdivided our data in the vertical sense using the zones and also aerially using the segments, while the non-net facies can be removed using the facies grouping tool. The filter associations tool can now be used to group zones, segments, and/or facies and groups thereof together by selecting the desired elements and hitting the associate button. So here I can group my Nome sandstones, find where my Crux 1 well is in my segment 3, and also pick up my net facies. And I can associate them together. And this generates a specific data set for the region of interest. I can then start building my saturation height function by clicking apply. So what this has done is produced a new card down here. And Ava Saturation is initially only using the CUDI4 function, although more saturation height function methods will be made available in the near future. So we've already on the roadmap, we have the Skelton-Harrison function coming very soon. And then we're also looking at capillary pressure-based methods such as the leverage J coming again in the not too distant future. So the CUDI4 function requires the bulk volume of water to be calculated, which is derived from the multiplication of water saturation and porosity. Ava Saturation will automatically reference the most appropriate water saturation and porosity and facies logs required for the calculation for each well. So here, Ava Saturation has referenced, I've got 5 different water saturation logs. So I can select the one I wish to use. I can then do the same for porosity. So I'll select the porosity log here. And then I've also got my facies log. And if I had multiple facies logs, it would of course reference all of those facies logs available. Once I'm happy with the logs that I've chosen, I can click apply and the BVW calculation is performed. So the resulting function tab displays the BVW versus the height above free water level cross plot and automatically derives the two constants A and B from the calculated regression line, where A is the intercept on the y-axis and B is the gradient of the line. I can then accept these constants and lock in these values for using in the following function mapping tool. However, it is possible to alter the fit of the regression line if we wish. So I can change these numbers to whichever I would like. And I can fit the data however I see fit according to my own geological choices. The default Ava saturation and calculator values are, however, fully preserved and can be reset. So this time I shall use the Ava saturation values. The resulting function can then be applied to the reservoir model by copying the desired function equation, either the SW function or BVW, to the clipboard, and then by pasting it directly into the Petrel calculator. An alternative to using the calculator statement and our most recent addition to Ava saturation is to use the function mapping tool of Ava saturation to automatically map the saturation concept to the selected grid within the Petrel model. So the function for a particular zone, segment, facies, or association can be applied to a grid by selecting it. And then if we wish to calculate our SW function as well, or SW property, sorry, and we have to select a porosity property. So once I click apply, Ava saturation will automatically generate an SW property, a BVW property, and a height above free water level property. And just before I do that though, by default, Ava saturation will make any undefined cells 100% water. Deselecting the toggle will keep undefined cells undefined. So I'm now ready to go, so I'll click apply. So at the moment, Ava saturation is, for want of a better word, hijacking the property creation workflow in Petrel and generating our SW, our BVW, and our height above free water level properties, which we can then view in the 3D window. Okay, so now we'll move over to the 3D window. I'll just expand the side pane a bit. So Ava saturation will create a specific folder with the same name as the saturation concept to house the created properties. Within this folder, a timestamp subfolder containing the BVW and the SW property can be found, and a time-stamped height above free water level property is also created. So, and just to show you that Ava saturation is doing exactly the same thing as, say, your Excel workflow, I also did exactly the same workflow using Excel and then copy and paste it using a calculator statement. And here's the Cuddy foil function again, using Excel and then Petrel calculator, and here's the Ava saturation. So I'll just jump back quickly into Ava saturation just to show you two more features. So Ava saturation is a data-aware application. So if, for example, I change the free water level, so I give it and hit apply. Ava saturation recognizes the change and gives me a notification that the saturation concept has been automatically updated. And finally, in the History tab, a record of the functions or the function and the details of the elements used to construct the function that have been applied to the reservoir model are kept. There we go. This provides the user with a quick overview of what data has gone into the applied function generated from the open saturation concept. It also sequentially details the audit trail of this particular saturation concept, showing a potential reviewer or auditor the workflow of constructing the saturation model. Now that I've shown you Ava Saturation, I'll hand back control to Laura for our second poll to find out what you'd like to see next in Ava Saturation.
So I'll just, excuse me, I'll just launch our second poll. And just as before, just use your screen to cast your vote for what you'd like us to see developing in Ava Saturation next. I'll give you a few seconds to vote and then I'll reveal the results. It seems not everyone's voted, so I'll give you a few more seconds to go ahead and pick the option you think is best for us to develop next in Ava Saturation. And please do vote because we'll use your responses in the discussion session at the end. So after voting, our audience would like to see more a capillary-based method, but also a TechLog platform bridge and a free water level prediction workflow as well, Matt.
Excellent, thank you very much. Yeah, we'll discuss some of those ideas later on in the Q&A session. As Laura said at the very beginning, we'll have Matt Boyer with us. He's the Ava Saturation product manager, so he'll be able to definitely give you an update on the product roadmap for Ava Saturation over the next months and year. So just before the question and answer session, I'll just quickly summarize what we've discussed today in the webinar. So hopefully I've shown that it's valuable to explore a variety of approaches to modeling water saturation. Because as you can see, different methods give you a different view of the fluid distribution within your reservoir. Well, Ava Saturation provides support when undertaking the saturation modeling workflow, increasing confidence in resulting estimates and development plans. Ava Saturation also allows users to construct and apply saturation functions directly to their reservoir model using our function mapping tool, whereas the full audit trail improves consistency, repeatability, efficiency, and increases reliability, and definitely decreases the likelihood of errors. So the simple and quick workflow also helps reduce the time for multi-well analysis and for the testing, reduces the time for multi-well analysis and for testing of multiple scenarios in volume distribution. And also in the future, when we add in multiple functions, you'll be able to test different methods of calculating saturation height function as well. So you'll have more data and be able to make more sound judgments about your reservoir. So with that, I shall hand over to Laura to chair the Q&A session. So do we have any questions from the audience, Laura?
Matthew, thank you for presenting today. It's been really great to see how Ava Saturation can be used to quickly and intuitively calculate multiple saturation height functions. As Matthew said, we'll go ahead and take some questions now. Just a quick reminder, please be sure to type your questions in the question box in your control panel, or alternatively, you can use the raise your hand option if you wish to join the discussion verbally instead. It looks like we have a question from someone who is saying that they might have missed it. They feel you might have mentioned it, Matt, but they're wondering when the Scott-Harrison function will be available.
Oh yes, I think I did mention it, but I don't think I actually gave a time estimate. So the Scout-Harrison function is actually going to be introduced very, very quickly. We're hoping in the next 2 weeks. So for our official sort of commercial release at the end of October, we'll have the Scout-Harrison and also the Cully-Four method in Ava Saturation.
Great, thank you, Matt. We have another question which relates to the grids. Someone's asking, when can you select grid and contact sets, and how do you define them?
So I'm going to pass that one over to Matt as the Ava product manager. He'll be able to give you a bit more of a technical answer to that question.
So the grid and contact sets, yeah, good question. The grid and contact sets are defined through part of obviously the static modeling process. So you build your 3D grid, you build your properties that go into that and define the fluid contacts at that stage. And you basically select the grid at the start of the saturation height modeling workflow. So there are two drop-down lists: one where you can choose the grid that you wish to use, and then one which you can use to select the contact. And once you've selected those two things, they're locked in, and then you use the zones, segments, fast use properties associated with that particular 3D grid. And you can also use the contact depth that's associated with the one that you've selected, which then is used to calculate the height above free water level for the various sort of zone segment combinations that you define.
Great, thanks, Matt. Someone else is asking about the audit trail. So Matthew, you spoke about it briefly throughout the presentation, but they want to know a little bit more about in detail what is preserved and how then that's accessed afterwards.
So yes, as I mentioned briefly, the audit trail will preserve all the calculations and also all the elements that have gone into the saturation concept. However, as I said, what we don't want to be doing is we don't want to be saving the confidential information. So what Ava Saturation actually does is it will only store and reference, or it will store the appropriate Petrel ID references effectively. So if you open up Ava Saturation in a certain Petrel model, Ava Saturation will know if you've used what sort of log properties you've used or what model properties you've also used to build your saturation concept. All this detail is then preserved into the audit trail. And what we also want to do is down the line sort of create the audit trail as being sort of a way to sort of also capture your geological choices. So you'll be able to sort of write a little comment to perhaps someone else that you're going to be sharing the saturation concept with. Write a little comment saying your geological choices. Why have you sort of grouped the Gnome A and Gnome B sandstones together? So in this example, it was fairly obvious because they're in pressure communication, or they're in communication. So that would be it's a geological choice to do that. So that sort of information could be preserved in the audit trail. What we also want to do is this audit trail will then become exportable, so you can actually export as a PDF, for example, with all the charts that you've created within Ava Saturation. So then you can then take that document to a review session, so you can share your saturation concept ideas with the rest of your team.
We've had another question from the audience wanting to ask how we're planning to develop the QC aspect. Will it be possible to compare SW from logs, core, etc.?
So again, I'm going to hand that one over to our Ava Ava Saturation product manager.
Yeah, that's a nice question. There are two sort of QC methods that I have sort of envisaged. One is to once we've built the saturation property within Petrel, is to then extract the logs from that and compare those back to the original Archie or Samando or basically the original log-based saturation. So you're comparing your predicted model saturations with your original log saturation. That's one way of doing it. And there is also an equivalent hydrocarbon column, equivalent pore column workflow where you can compare the averages within the grid with the averages of the logs as well, which I've envisaged. But if you do have any suggestions, obviously we're very interested to hear what other methods people are interested in terms of QC. So that'd be really useful if you've got any suggestions.
Thanks, Matt. I wondered, because we were discussing it earlier as part of the poll, whether either of you could comment at all on people's responses. So in the final question, we asked what they'd like to see, what people might like to see next in saturation, and the responses, just as a reminder, were 75% of respondents said that they'd like to see capillary-based methods, while 25% of people said that they'd like to see free water level prediction workflows. So can you comment a little bit more on those, what the plans are for saturation with respect to those, and yeah, just a bit more information about them.
Okay, so that's quite interesting, because most of the things in that poll are actually on the product roadmap for the rest of this year and into next year, so that's good. But it's good to get some feedback from people for what we should high rank. So it looks pretty clear that people are interested in different methods and being able to compare and contrast those, which I think is pretty cool. And obviously being able to incorporate, when you have capillary pressure data, being able to incorporate that is really key. We do have a free water level prediction workflow already sort of worked up in unsurprisingly spreadsheets at the moment, which will then sort of build into the application. And the tech log link, actually, we do have somebody looking at that at the moment. And the idea behind the tech log link is for organizations where petrophysicists are doing all the hard work, is to be able to take their data and seamlessly integrate that into the reservoir model in Petrel, so that then geologists and REs can very quickly, very easily take the petrophysicist work and throw that at the reservoir model. So the link will take the form of sort of two approaches, essentially. One is to take the log data straight out of tech logs, so your Archie logs, your density porosity logs, and so forth. Take that in, and then a geologist can use Ava Saturation to generate the functions, or we can take across the petrophysicist derived function and just use our function mapping software to very quickly create the property within Petrel, so that you're not having to write long if statements, you're not having to fiddle around with calculated statements and things like that. So we can very quickly just build the 3D property within Petrel, and you can spend more time testing uncertainty around your saturation functions, testing what happens if you change the fit of the regression line, or what happens if you change the method, and you can very quickly generate multiple properties, and you can then see what that impact has on the reservoir volumes.
Great, thank you, Matt. So one of the attendees is very eagle-eyed and noticed that as you were navigating into Petrel, Matt, you had some other Ava products, and they wanted to know more a little bit about what other software is available in the Ava family.
Okay, so the other products within the Ava family. So we have Ava Clastics, which is an analog-based application. So what Ava Clastics does is it gives you access to the world-class analogs databases from the University of Leeds. So you get access to the fluvial database, shallow marine and deep marine databases. So it allows you to constrain your fascist models with real-life analogs. So you can get access to, as I say, all the good work that the guys at the University of Leeds have done, and it allows you to basically populate your fascist models with realistic sedimentary bodies, essentially. And we also have a link with a bridge into Petrel as well. So once you've selected the appropriate dimensions for, say, your fluvial channels, you can very seamlessly then apply that to the reservoir model. So you're not having to manually type things in and potentially get errors and things. So it speeds that process up. And again, it's all about preserving the audit trail. So any numbers, any decisions that you make within Ava Clastics are stored within something that's called a depositional concept. And then, as I say, applied to the reservoir model using the Petrel link that we have. Ava Structure, similar kind of application. It's designed to help with structural uncertainty in terms of how faults link and join together, because typically the faults that you interpret on seismic, it's not the full size of a fault in real life. So the tip regions generally go below seismic resolution. So Ava Structure uses known structural principles and known structural techniques to try and allow you to assess how faults may link, how faults may join together. And it allows you to create multiple realizations, so you can build multiple structural models. Some structural models where all the faults connect, some where they connect slightly less, but it's using proper structural geology techniques and principles. So you can create multiple structural models, so that then you can then test that in the reservoir simulation and see what actually happens to your compartments. Do you have one big compartment where you only need, say, 2 wells in it, or do you have 20 compartments? Each one needs to produce an injector. and you can begin to play games in that and actually begin to understand the uncertainty around your structural models.
Great, thank you, Matt. And one final question. If anyone wanted to get their hands on Ava Saturation, how might they go about doing that?
A good question. I'm glad someone's asking that one. Ava Saturation is going to be commercially released at the end of October, but we're also doing a 3-month free evaluation trial period where you can actually get your hands on Ava Saturation for free for 3 months, and try and use it in anger, as it were. Use it on your own models, building saturation concepts, so you can really see the power of Ava Saturation. And I think Matt might want to add some more stuff about the licensing, or
I think you've covered most of it, Matt. Yeah, it's just important to say it's a full production license. You can use it on your own data sets, use it in real life projects, and it costs you nothing for 3 months, and that's probably all there is to say. If you're interested, then please do get in touch. I think you've got some email addresses to put up on the screen. Just email either myself or Matt, and we can certainly set you up with a 3-month free production license.
So we've had one final question, which I think I'll be able to answer. So there's a question about whether we'll be holding more webinars about not only Ava Saturation but our other Ava products. As it happens, we hosted one last month about Ava Clastics, and we do have another webinar in the making, but the details of that aren't finished yet. So I won't be saying much about that, but expect it sometime later on in the autumn, probably November time. But on our website, we advertise all our upcoming events. So any webinars that we do host will be advertised at least a few weeks in advance on there, so just keep tuned to those. The webinar that we hosted last month will be available on our website in the not too distant future as well. So for people who couldn't attend that one, they'll be able to revisit it by visiting the website in a few weeks' time. So it looks like we've covered all the questions, and I don't think either of the Matts want to add anything else, but I'll give them the opportunity to do that now if they so wish. So no, it seems like we're all done. So thank you to everyone. We appreciate you all being here. This webinar has been recorded, and attendees should receive a copy via email in the next 24 hours or so. For those of you who haven't been able to attend or have had to leave early, we'll be making this webinar and all our other webinars available on our website very soon. If you'd like to find out more about Ava Saturation and how it can help you reduce uncertainty in your geomodels, please visit our website, which is shown on the screen right now. But if you'd also like more information about Ava Saturation, our 3-month offer, or any more details about the application, please do feel free to email Matthew or Matt. Their email address is being shown on the screen now as well. So please do stay tuned to our news and events pages on our website for details of other Ava webinars, particularly one before the end of the year. In the meantime, though, you can join us for a complimentary lunch if you're in the Aberdeen area, where we'll be showcasing the latest in our geomodeling technologies. That's taking place on Thursday. Alternatively, you can come and have a drink with us in London next month in an evening networking event. And we'll also be at PETEX 2018 with a booth. You can visit our news and events pages on our website for the full details about all those events and how to register to attend. We thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next time.